This lesson deals with understanding buyers. In this particular lecture, we'll talk about what are the two main categories of buyers and what categorizes business markets. Then, what are some of the things that salespeople can do to enhance the selling process for buyers? We'll also talk about some of the typical types of purchase decisions that are made in an organization and how to determine the buyer's communication style in order to enhance engagement in the selling process. It's important to first point out that there's two main categories of buyers. The first one is the consumer market. You yourself are an individual consumer and part of the consumer market. When you buy groceries or clothing or you go on vacations, this is part of the consumer market. It's the market in which consumers purchase goods and services for their own consumption. On the other hand, a business market is composed of firms, institutions, and governments who acquire goods and services. And the reason to acquire these goods and services are usually for the next three reasons. They use them as inputs in their manufacturing processes in order to develop and make their own products. If you think about a car, all of the products that go into making that car have to be purchased from someone as a supplier. Firms use them in their day-to-day operations. This may be simple things like paper, internet service, and computers. And sometimes businesses buy products just to resell to their own customers. If you think about a retail store or a grocery store like Kroger or Walmart, they purchase groceries in order to resell for a profit to an end consumer. There are some unique characteristics of business markets to consider, and these are important factors for salespeople to realize. This deals with the types of demand, for one. There's what we call concentrated demand, and this is different from the consumer market. In the consumer market, there's usually a lot of buyers, and you can have very large segments of buyers. But in the business market, there's usually a small number of large buyers that account for most of the purchases. And this can have a really large impact on the salesperson's selling process and their account management. If you think about it, maybe as a salesperson you have 10 clients, and they are the ones that you sell to on a regular basis and make your living. If you lose one of those clients, it could have a major impact on your firm's profitability and could also have a big impact on your take-home pay. There's also what we call derived demand. This type of demand is closely tied to demand for consumer goods. I mentioned cars earlier. Let's say that Nissan or Ford or Toyota notices that there is a much larger increase in demand for certain types of cars or trucks. Based on that consumer demand, it will increase demand for all the parts that go into making those cars and trucks. There's also a higher level of demand fluctuation within business buying situation. The demand is more volatile because it relies on that consumer demand. And fluctuation means that business markets must be reactive in their manufacturing and operation processes in order to be able to meet that demand. And these fluctuations can be surprising and unanticipated. Also, buyers as purchasing professionals is very common in business-to-business sales. So the buyers are professionally trained. They have a set of processes that they may have to go through in order to make a purchase. It may involve a lot of different people that are involved in that buying process and different influences. And usually, there are collaborative buyer-seller relationships, and this goes back to that trust-based selling process. Let's look at the main stages in the buying process. Just like in the consumer buying decision process, there are quite a few stages that the buyer will probably go through before a purchase decision is made. These are the main stages. They recognize a problem, They describe what the needs are in order to solve that problem. They usually have some type of product specifications so that they won't even consider a product from a salesperson that doesn't meet those basic specs. They'll search for suppliers and determine if there's a small or large set of suppliers that could potentially meet their needs. Then, usually, what will happen is the buyer will solicit proposals from the selling organizations. In that proposal, they're usually asking for a series of specifications and also pricing information. From there, they will probably spend a lot of time interacting with the salesperson. And the sales dialogue will begin and sometimes be quite a long process. From there, they will select the supplier. Then they will order the product or the service, and afterwards conduct a performance review. And this sometimes becomes a cyclical process. If the performance review is positive, they'll probably consider buying from that seller again. If the performance review is negative, chances are that selling organization won't get another chance. Usually that first step is determined when there's a needs gap. Just like in the consumer market, if you realize that your current pair of shoes is worn out and starting to fall apart, you have a needs gap between your desired state, which is having a pair of shoes that isn't falling apart and that you can wear every day, between your actual state, which is a pair of shoes that is falling apart. It's the same in business. Perhaps their desired state, in this example, deals with production. They need to increase production, and their current state is that the equipment that they have only allows them to produce 1,000 units per day instead of the 1,250 that they'd like to produce. This is where the problem recognition would occur. We're skipping a few steps here, but we're going to focus on the buyer evaluation and procedures that can enhance selling strategies. A lot of times, when the buyer writes up specifications and requests proposals from the seller, they may return back to them and say that they don't meet certain specifications, or they don't have some of the qualities in their product or service that the buyer needs. So, depending on what the seller's product or service is, they may be able to modify their proposed product offering. It's much easier to do with services, but sometimes they can actually alter products or create a new product that will meet the buyer's needs. Sometimes, instead of modifying the product, what the seller can do is try to alter the buyer's belief about either the proposed offering and what it can accomplish, or alter beliefs about a competitor's offering. And there's a couple strategies you can use to do this. But the one strategy you never want to do is to speak negatively about a competitor's offering. It's always better to focus on your product and what the benefits of your product are. You can also alter the important weights of some of those specifications. You could focus on some of the things you know about the marketplace and maybe current trends, and try to alter how the buyer feels about some of the things that they think they need or want. Sometimes a good strategy for a seller is to pay attention to neglected attributes. Maybe there's some attributes that your product can offer that the buyer doesn't think very much about at the time. You can focus their attention on those attributes and explain how they can help the buyer in their business. It's also good to consider what type of purchase decision is being made. Usually, as a salesperson, this determines how much involvement you're going to have with that client or that prospect. You may have seen these before. The decision types are straight rebuy, modified rebuy, and a new task purchase. In a straight rebuy, there's not a lot of reconsideration on the part of the buyer. It's something that they've bought before. It's not a new problem or need, and they don't need a lot of to conduct a lot of search or consider a lot of alternatives. chances are they're going to buy from the company that they purchased from before. If you think about things like office equipment or daily office equipment like paper and pencils and pens, chances are they're not going to consider buying from a new vendor every time they order pens. A modified rebuy would be thinking about a product or service that's been purchased before, but maybe the buyer has a change in needs that has motivated them to look for other sellers. Maybe this is computer equipment. Companies tend to replace computers on a semi-regular basis, but the equipment can be semi-expensive, and perhaps their needs are not being quite met with their current supplier. A new task buy would be when the problem is new and the need could be very high. They usually require then a lot of information. They do an extensive information search, and they consider multiple alternatives from selling organizations. This tends to be the longest selling process and the longest sales dialogue for the salesperson. And we can also look at these this way. A straight rebuy is more habitual and routine, whereas a new task buy is extensive consideration and decision making. And the modified rebuy is usually somewhere in between on that continuum. One thing that a salesperson should start to think about early on in their sales profession is how to understand the buyer's communication style. As with any kind of relationship, the more you understand the other person, the better able you will be to adapt to them and communicate in a way that's beneficial to you both. These are the principal characteristics of assertiveness and responsiveness. The next time you speak to someone, really anyone, try to see if you can determine where they fit on this assertiveness and responsiveness chart. People who are low on assertiveness tend to be good team players and supportive, but they're not risk takers, and they tend to be very slow-paced and very reserved in expressing their opinions. From a salesperson's point of view, this could be frustrating if you're trying to get information and you can't really get a good feel on how that person is reacting to your proposal. This can be challenging, but knowing how to deal with that person and realize that they are reserved and they're maybe not willing to take risks, you can alter your selling approach. People, on the other hand, who are high in assertiveness tend to be competitive and risk takers. They also can usually be more willing to make independent decisions, but they can also be confrontational and very forcefully express their opinions. Depending on what your sales situation is, this could be challenging or it could be helpful. You might get the information you need quicker and in a more honest fashion. Let's talk about responsiveness. People who are low in responsiveness tend to be guarded and cool, very rational, and very meticulous in their organizations. They also tend to be inflexible when it comes to time, and they tend to be more formal in their communication and interactions with other people. On the other hand, people who are high in responsiveness, they like relationships, and they're very open and warm, but they're also emotional and highly animated. They also can be spontaneous. So considering these things, you may have to adapt your selling style to go along with the communication style of the buyer. It's not really their position to go along with the style of the seller. To simplify this a little bit more, someone who is high or low in responsiveness or high or low in assertiveness tends to be characterized by one of these 4 quadrants. Take a look at this and decide where you think you fit as an individual. As a salesperson, then, we usually engage in what we call communication style flexing. To enhance communication, salespeople really need to adapt their communication style to that of the buyer and not the other way around. This typically will have positive impacts for the seller. Usually their performance increases, meaning they're able to sell more or more frequently or earn a higher sale from one particular buyer. Chances are that buyer is also going to trust the salesperson more if they're willing to adapt their style to meet their needs. And it tends to have positive impact on the quality of the buyer-seller relationship. So how do we engage customers? Buyers depend on salespeople to provide unique and value-added solutions. They expect salespeople to be easily accessible. If they have a problem or give you a call or an email, the expectation is that you're going to be responsive to that and accessible, sometimes more than you really want to be. Talk to someone who works in sales. Ask them how often their phone rings after 5 o'clock or on the weekends. So salespeople must have a comprehensive knowledge about their products and their competitor products, and a thorough understanding of the needs of the customers. And they should be able to solve problems that may arise after the sale. After the sale frequently is where some of those value-added activities take place. In summary, consumer and business markets vary based on their different characteristics. There are 3 main types of purchasing decisions: straight rebuy, modified rebuy, and new task buy. Experienced salespeople emphasize the importance of reading and responding to customer communication styles. Buying teams